Hello and welcome to Unacademy, one-stop destination for civil services aspirants in English medium. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take up the Delhi edition of today's newspaper and look at the various important topics from the prelims and the mains perspective. And at the end of it, discuss two important questions which can be asked from these areas and discuss the art of answer writing along with that as well. Now, before we jump into the topics, a minor announcement regarding the NCERT Fundamentals, the series that we are starting, where we shall be covering various different subjects and the topics included in the basics of NCERTs that will be conducted from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. on the app is where you can join us. Now, coming to the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for today. So today in total, we are going to have a discussion for 8 different topics. So out of those, 4 of them are going to be discussed in detail. So Kerala takes a pioneering step to fight antimicrobial resistance under Operation Amrit. So this has appeared in page 10. That is going to be relevant for GS paper 3. Now, in the FAQ section of the Sunday's newspaper, I hope you are aware there's a separate FAQ section. There, what is the SC's interim order on the Forest Act? So here, even though this was in news last week as well, we are going to discern and analyze the interim order, and we are going to analyze about the amendments to the Forest Conservation Act 1980 as well. So that is relevant for GS paper 3. Then, is the Ukraine war changing the world order? Relevant for GS paper 2. Thereby, we are going to discuss about the aspects of the Russia-Ukraine war marking the 2-year anniversary since the onslaught began. The Global South stand on Israel's war in Gaza. So we are going to use this particular article to discuss some tidbits about prelims as well. And along with that, we are going to discuss about India's stance and its relevance in the Global South. So that is going to be relevant again for your GS paper 2. Now, few of the portions relevant for your prelims. So, data on household consumption expenditure survey has been released after a gap of around 11 years. So, that is something which has appeared in page 1. Then, Edwards syndrome, that is what it is and why are we discussing this? Then, engineering exports may turn positive despite weak demand. So, we'll use this to understand what the engineering exports are and what our export markets actually are. Then the Samakka Saralamma Jatara, the largest tribal festival in the world, has been initiated and has begun. So what that is. So starting with the first article of the day, Kerala takes a pioneering step to curb antimicrobial resistance. Now, what do we understand by antimicrobial resistance? What do we mean by antimicrobials, first of all? And then, let us understand what is it that Kerala has done. So, first of all, getting to the root cause of it, what is AMR or antimicrobial resistance? So, antimicrobials include the antiparasitics, antifungals, antibacterial, all those various different medicines which are used to cure infections. So as per the WHO, antimicrobials are used to prevent and treat infectious diseases in humans, animals, and plants. So those are classified as antimicrobials. Now, what is AMR or antimicrobial resistance? So let's suppose when we say any antibiotic or any antimicrobial, if I have consumed enough of antimicrobials in my life, then later on, my body or the microbes which are present there, they might develop resistance to it. Right? So that is where many of the microbes, they develop resistance to these antimicrobials. As a result of that, if let's suppose you fall ill or you contact that infection by those antimicrobe or those microbes which have developed that resistance, it will be of a whole different proposition. Okay. So AMR occurs when the bacterium, the viruses, all the various microbes, they develop a resistance to the antimicrobials. Okay. So why does that happen? inappropriate use of antimicrobials, wanton and unsustainable use. Even for slightest of fever, you would have seen people prescribing you that take this antibiotic, right? Take this particular medicine, it will go away in the day. Even for a slightest of cough and cold, people do prescribe these antibiotics. So when you have inappropriate use of antimicrobials, the bacterium, they start developing resistance to those antimicrobials, right? Now, as a result of that, the antimicrobials end up becoming less and less effective. So now that the medicines that you would earlier take, which would cure the illnesses that you had, now those medicines start becoming slightly less effective. So as a result of that, your illness also gets exaggerated. And these bacterium then, they become infectious and they spread more easily. Because now the various different medicines, they are unable to treat those diseases. So the medicines start becoming ineffective. So that is antimicrobial resistance. Now, how does antimicrobial resistance spread? Here you have seen that diseases spread more easily. But how do these diseases spread? So there are various different factors and various different cycles through which this disease can spread. And one of those is the poultry, the fishery sector, and one of those is the direct contamination from human to human, or the contamination that we gather, let's suppose, from the hospitals that we have visited. Because mind you, at the end of the day, the hospitals, they are the germinating centers in many of the cases for these antimicrobial resistant microbes, right? So those microbes which are resistant to these antimicrobials, they are significantly to be found in the hospitals. So if the hospitals are not properly sanitized and cleaned, they become centers for the spread of these diseases. So let us take a look at this chart. So first of all, if an individual takes in lot of these medicines, antibiotics, for example, let's suppose, now from an individual basis, let's suppose, so that individual develops the resistance, in the sense the germs, the various bacterium, pathogens which are normally present in our body, they develop a kind of a resistance to these antibiotics now. Now, once that resistance is developed, right, so here they get antibiotic and the resistant bacterium develops. Now, eventually, let's suppose that individual has visited a hospital. Now, thereby, that bacterium can spread from this patient to the hospital and from the hospital to the other people who are visiting the hospital. So there can be a large scale spread from the hospitals and they become the germinating centers. Other than that, the bacterium can directly spread from that individual to his relatives, family members, etc., and the person that he gets in contact with. So thereby, there can be a community spread which can happen directly from this individual as well. So a wanton use or an unsustainable use of antibiotics by one individual can lead to an increased chances of severe diseases and infections in the larger community. Okay? Then, many of the times, when we talk about the poultry sector, the fisheries sector, now in these sectors as well, you will find that antibiotics and growth promotional antibiotics are regularly administered in order to get better yield or quick growth, etc. So as a result of that, the animal bodies and the animals, they also start developing that antimicrobial resistance. And when I say the animals develop those resistance, it is basically the microbes, the germs contained within the body. Now, if they are consumed directly, that also spreads such bacterium and germs in the larger community. Or from their body, through the feces and through the excreta, that germs, they go to the soil. Sometimes the animal feces and the animal excreta, etc., are utilized to make manures, to make, let's suppose, various different types of fertility-inducing chemicals in the soil. So all of that eventually passes down and accumulates into the crops. And even if you are consuming, let's suppose you are a vegetarian, you are having a vegetarian diet, even if you are consuming those crops, a larger community spread can happen. So that is how this antimicrobial resistance can spread. So that is why in 2011, the government had come out with an order whereby it listed certain antibiotics under Schedule H1. Under Schedule H1 of the drugs control rules. That is where certain antibiotics were listed in. And those antibiotics which were listed under this, they could not be sold over the counter. And that is where, in line to prevent this antimicrobial resistance, the government had also come up with the very famous Red Line campaign. You would have heard about the Red Line campaign. Now, this Red Line campaign is that in the case of the antibiotics, you find that unique red line marking. Now, that is to raise the awareness that such kind of medicines and antibiotics should not be sold over the counter. That is, you go to a particular pharmacy, you buy certain medicines and get back. Only after a written and a given prescription should you be given those antibiotics. Now, antibiotics are of different varieties. Depending upon their efficacy, the power that they have different varieties. Right? The second, first, third generation, fourth generation, and so on. Now, the government passed the order that you cannot sell these antibiotics over the counter. You need to get the doctor's prescription. But recently we talked about the fact that the doctor-to-patient ratio in our country is abysmally low, is very, very poor. So if the doctor-to-patient ratio is not there, that means for an individual who is living in a rural area, let's suppose I am suffering from an illness, I will never be able to gain an antibiotic or get an antibiotic because first of all, I'll have to find a doctor, which in itself is almost an impossible task. So looking at these deficiencies in the entire medical system, the Chennai Declaration basically allowed the first generation of antibiotics to be sold over the counter. So there was a dilution of the 2011 notification. So that dilution basically allowed selling some of these antibiotics over the counter, just because we don't have enough diagnostic centers, we don't have enough doctors available readily. So it should not be the case that poor people are denied the access to antibiotics. Now, what is it that Kerala has done, due to which this article has been written? So Kerala recently has launched what is referred to as Operation Amrit. Now this Operation Amrit, basically it talks about, again going back to the 2011 norms, that none of the antibiotics shall be sold over the counter. And here you definitely need a doctor's prescription in order to go and buy and procure an antibiotic. Okay, so under this initiative, the pharmacies must keep an accurate record of the antibiotic sales, and they must display a caveat warning that the antibiotics will be sold only after doctor's prescription. Now, Kerala has done that, which is laudable. But Kerala can afford to do that. Why? Because of certain reasons. First of all, the doctor-to-patient ratio is favorable in Kerala. Patient ratio, unlike, let's suppose, in Odisha, unlike Jharkhand, unlike Bihar, so the doctor-to-patient ratio is significantly favorable. So that means you have enough doctors which are available. Secondly, you have a higher literacy rate. Literacy rate is high. What does that mean? That basically means there is significant amount of awareness. And that awareness raising can also be done if the literacy rate is already there, significantly and very quickly. Large amount of awareness can be raised amongst the public by displaying these kind of statutory warnings or these kind of issues that, okay, antibiotic sales, let's suppose they would not be done without the doctor's prescription. So that is where that awareness factor also plays a role. Kerala also has a very good health monitoring system. And by health monitoring system, we here refer to that if there is any hospital-induced illness, that is immediately reported into the system and it is taken care of. It is this reason that majority of the outbreaks that you see, they are first of all reported in Kerala. For few of them, they actually are contracted in Kerala first, but in many of the parts of the country, they go unreported. It is the Kerala's health system which has a very good and adequate reportage, due to which these hospital-induced infections, etc., are caught early. But for the rest of the country, and in fact the rest of the developing world, this antimicrobial resistance is a kind of a danger, is a kind of a scourge. WHO in its report has released that if by 2050, if this antimicrobial resistance is not taken care of, then by 2050, we will start losing one individual every 3 minutes because of these kind of drug-resistant microbes. Because once these microbes become drug-resistant, you will have to deploy a higher or the next generation of antibiotics. Much more than that, many of the time, your body will not be able to support that. Already in India, you have increasing cases of drug-resistant typhoid, drug-resistant malaria, all of that coming into place. And why is this happening? Why is it that antimicrobial resistance and these kind of microbes are increasingly being found in these developing nations? It is happening because of certain lacunae in our health system. First of all, we don't have enough awareness. We feel that popping antibiotics is a kind of wellness mechanism that everybody is deploying. It is like you can pop a kind of a digestive tablet. Similarly, let's take an antibiotic. I won't be ill, right? My cold and cough will be taken care of. But in the name of taking care of cough and cold, you are actually worsening your scenario 5 or 10 years down the line. Secondly, you don't, or all of us in the entirety of the country, we all would have faced this problem one time or the other, where we don't have enough reliable diagnostic centers. And even if the diagnostic centers are available, they are not available at an affordable cost. So lack of efficiency and affordability of the diagnostic centers. So as a result of that, let's suppose you are facing an illness. To get yourself tested, you never know if the output will be given on time, or first of all, how much money you have to splurge in it. And secondly, you don't know whether that report will be reliable or not. So many of the patients, they straight away go to the doctor and they rather encourage the doctor to give them antibiotics straight away. And they would wait for it before going for a test. So that is why these kind of incidents or usage of antibiotics is increasing. And another factor is an acute shortage of trained medical professionals, doctors, etc. Due to which every other individual owning a pharmacy, they become a doctor on their own and they start prescribing all the different types of medicines. If you have a stomach ache, they will prescribe you medicine to the level that maybe it can cure the worst of the diseases. So that is where the problem lies. Now, what is the way forward? The way forward basically is taking care of all these issues that I have cited just now. So here, if you take a look at it, efficient and affordable diagnostic centers, increase in awareness on the side of the patients, Diagnostic centers are very much required to be monitored, regulated as well. Okay. Then better sanitation and hygiene so that these microbes, they don't spread from the soil, from the contaminated water, the contaminated food that you consume. From that, it does not spread into the body system easily. Data collection regarding hospital-induced illnesses should be there, and it should be made a priority for all the hospitals to report that data. Then banning growth promotional antibiotics in poultry, fisheries sector and the entire animal husbandry sector, so that those animals, they don't become the carriers of such kind of microbes. So these are important and relevant because understand, you have to link it to the economic poverty and the rural poverty as well that it can induce, and it does induce. These kind of diseases, they are much difficult to treat and eventually leads to an increased out-of-pocket expenditure of the household. And that out-of-pocket expenditure, when it is very high, and an individual, let's suppose, who falls ill, that individual might be the sole earning member of the family, increased household expenditure, thereby further pushing the poor family into debt levels, which is not sustainable. Okay, so this is the way forward. So in this article, we have seen what is antimicrobial resistance, how does it spread, why is it spreading in countries like India and all the developing nations of the world, what is Operation Amrit by Kerala government, why is it that the Kerala government could do that, and what is the eventual way forward. Okay, now let us take a look at the Supreme Court's interim order on the Forest Act. Now, the Supreme Court earlier this week had issued an interim order and asked the government to consider the dictionary meaning of forest for all practical purposes till it comes out with its final verdict. Now, most of you would have heard about these news stories, dictionary meaning of forest. But what is the difference between what the states and the governments regard as the forest and what is the dictionary meaning of forest here? And why is that important or order relevant? Why is it that the central government amended the Forest Act of 1980? So very briefly, let me tell you about the brief background of the entire aspect and the entire scenario. So, Forest Acts in India have been in place since British times. Now, the earliest attempt to regulate the forest and the usage of forest was done by the Britishers in 1865 itself. Now, and that was not a proper regulation or a proper legislation in the terms of its extent, very crude form. But then, the motive of the British government was to reduce in the access that we Indians could have in the forest areas. Access to timber, forest produce, etc. Now, for that, the government in 1927, they passed the Forest Act. Now, under this 1927 Forest Act, they could reduce our access to timber and various other products, and in many of the areas, basically restrict the access in the forest land itself. Now, this meant that the government could declare certain areas as reserved forest. So, under this, certain areas were declared as reserved forests. But here also, after independence, there was a need to have and modify this Forest Act with the purpose to increase the forest cover, to help us fight climate change, and at the same time ensure that it is not discriminatory. It is not used by the private players and the corporations in an illegal manner. So that is when, in 1980, Forest Conservation Act was passed. Forest Conservation Act was passed. The aim and the objective was to protect the forests. protect the cutting down of the forest. Now let's suppose there is a state. Here, let's name the state XYZ to ward off any controversy. Now this state has got greener areas in various different regions. Let's suppose this is also an area of natural vegetation. This is also an area of a natural vegetation. This is also an area of a natural vegetation. This is also an area of natural vegetation, and so on. Now, what is a forest? After all, this act is Forest Conservation Act. So what is a forest? So each and every state, they had their own classification that, okay, this would constitute a forest, right? That area would constitute a forest. Let's suppose under the provisions of this state XYZ, for example, here if let's suppose consider Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, etc., they have a particular dimension that only an area exceeding 10 hectares, 100 hectares, only those having this much density of trees, they can be considered as forest, and so on. That is variable amongst the various states. So let's suppose this XYZ state, under its norms, that has declared this area as a reserved forest. Reserved forest under the provisions of 1980 Act. So that means what? That means that this area will now be protected. You cannot cut trees from this area. Why? Because it will fall under the purview of Forest Conservation Act. But what about this area, and these areas? These are also areas of natural vegetation. So after 1980, after this act was passed, it was found out that the states are using this particular loophole in the act, where you don't have a set standard for demarcation of a forest. They are using this loophole to basically reserve only some part of the forest. And they are deciding the norm that, okay, if these conditions are fulfilled, only then it can be a forest. That means certain areas will be left and which will not be declared as a forest. And then these would be diverted to mining companies, illegal timber felling, deforestation, etc. could be carried out. Now, one such incident was highlighted in the Gudlur region, where illegal felling of the timber was found out. And this matter reached the doorsteps of the Supreme Court. Now, that is where the Supreme Court, in its very landmark Godavarman judgment, of when? Of 1996. 12th of December 1996, the Supreme Court came out with that landmark T.N. Godavarman judgment. And the judgment was, basically, the case went to the Supreme Court that, look, okay, this is the reserved forest, I will not cut trees here, but what about the other green areas? Isn't our job there to protect the natural vegetation? So the Supreme Court issued the statement and issued the judgment that for all practical purposes, consider deforestation as a crime. Deforestation should not be allowed. It should not be allowed in the reserved forest area. It should neither be allowed in other green areas. That is where you have to consider the dictionary meaning of deforestation, forest, etc. It should not be the case that if an area is not defined as a reserved forest, you can carry out deforestation in that area. It was to protect the green vegetation of the country. Now, after this, what happened? After this, what had happened was that a blanket ban on deforestation in principle was applied. Now, the states, what they started doing was that these areas, which were not a part of the reserved forest, they were put under a new category, what was referred to as the deemed forests. They are deemed to be forests. They are not the reserved forest, but you have enough green cover which are deemed to be forests. Because by this time of 1996, from 1980 to 1996, already there were hundreds of hectares of land which had been diverted by various different state governments to the private players for different proportions and different propositions. But after 1996, there was a blanket ban on deforestation. Now, overall, this seems to be very fair and good. But this also raised a few problems. What were the problems? Let's suppose you are a mining company. Let's suppose you are a mining company ABC. Now, under the provisions of the 1980 Act, in the year 1984 or 1985, this XYZ state, you have given the XYZ state few bundles of crores, and the XYZ state has transferred this for your mining purposes, that you can do mining here. So you have paid money as well. You have got the related papers also. You have started mining there also. But after that, the Godavarman judgment basically tells this to be a deemed forest. No deforestation can happen. So as a corporation, and many of the times as an individual who, let's suppose, is builder, or as even government agencies who have basically acquired land in these areas to construct roads, various different types of infrastructure support, you are suddenly in a fix, you are in a turmoil that I have acquired land and now the Godavarman judgment is telling me I cannot do anything on this land anymore. So there were various different issues faced. As a result, to get rid of these issues, the government came up with the Forest Conservation Amendment Act 2023. Now, even though the amendment is very significantly large and it is very diverse, let us consider the brief gist of the amendment. What does this amendment actually talk about? And where is it that the opposition is coming from? So basically, this amendment, if you take a look at it, it makes the Forest Conservation Act 1980, the provisions of the Act of 1980, is restricted to only a certain type of land. Few of the lands and few of the type of land have been exempted from the provisions of the Forest Conservation Act 1980. So on which type of land is the Forest Conservation Act going to be applicable? On the land which were declared as forest under the Forest Act 1927, under this act which were declared as forest, under this act whichever was declared as a forest, right? Or in government records after the 1980 Act came into effect. However, here it will not be applicable for the land converted to non-forest use before the Godavarman judgment. That means if you had bought this land before the Godavarman judgment and it was all legal, fair enough. Now you can carry out the work. You should not be taken, or you will not be dragged to the court because the Godavarman judgment was not taken in retrospective effect. Then it also exempts certain other types of land. For example, for security installations. Now 100-kilometer land near the border area for strategic defense constructions, border highways, bridges, etc. Many of the times in the forest areas, let's suppose, you would have also have come across the scenario. In the forest areas, let's suppose you have two habitations in the larger region of the forest. It is not connected by road immediately, but due to the terrain, oftentimes you have to take a larger route, diversionary route, to reach the other region. So, in order to construct, let's suppose, bridges, and for these basic purposes, the lands have been made an exemption for. Okay. this is where the maximum opposition is coming. That why are you making any land exempted? And because protection of forest means protection of forest. The argument on the side of the government is we have to take care of the national strategic needs as well. We have to take care and we have to ensure that the security forces, they don't suffer any drawbacks at the bordering areas if that is forested. We have to ensure that proper drinking water sanitation facilities can be provided in the forested habitations as well, because the forest dwellers have as much right to have a good standard of living as you and I have. So that was the argument on the side of the government. Now, there was another provision and another aspect of the amendment. So the Act specifies some activities that can be carried out. For example, the jungle safaris, setting up of zoos, etc. in the region of the forest. Now here also there has been significant amount of opposition. First of all, why is it that you need to set up a zoo in the middle of a forest? Right? Zoos can be set up in other areas, in the boundary regions, in the vicinity. Secondly, the argument on the side of the government has been that, look, we are doing this in order to generate revenue. All the countries of the world, they do this in order to increase the tourist footfalls, in order to increase the revenue, and that will benefit the local population at the end of the day. Local population will get some money. The argument from the other side is that these kind of enabling provisions are also there as per the Forest Rights Act 2006. Why do you need the amendment? Under this amendment, private players will enter and they will exploit it. So that is why this is being opposed tooth and nail. And the argument is that, look, consider now, Supreme Court in its interim order has put a stay on these provision as well. That please, till the final verdict does not come out, do not start using this provision, because the Haryana government has demarcated a region around the Aravallis, which is not a reserved forest, a deemed forested area, for that ecotourism and safari purposes. And that is touted by the activists as a dangerous move. So that is why the Supreme Court has stayed this provision. And it has said that until we come out with the final verdict about the Conservation Act, whether that should be there or not, do use the dictionary meaning of the forest. And do not exempt any land, because the exemption will lead to finding of loopholes. So that is why the final verdict is something that is eagerly awaited now. Okay, so that is the brief backdrop of the story which has been doing rounds for the week, and this will be doing rounds going ahead again for the next couple of weeks. Overall, if you understand this entire episode in gist, so it is the provision of the Forest Conservation Act 1980. What are the problems it caused because of the definition of the forest? Any state can do anything. Now, another thing that Supreme Court has basically brought out is that by the month of April, there needs to be a consolidated list by the state and the union about the deemed and the reserved forest. So that there should not be that discretionary facility that, okay, this is not reserved, this is discretionary, or this is deemed and use it. Or this is not even deemed forest, this is just some green patch and I will divert it to the private parties. Because large areas in the northeastern part of the country, they have suffered destruction and deforestation because of these kind of loopholes. Okay? Now, coming to the next article. It is about the Ukraine war. Is the Ukraine war changing the world order? Now, here, this is an ongoing story for the past couple of years. And yesterday marked the 2-year anniversary since the offensive on the Ukraine front actually began. So this article basically analyzes whether that was a calculated move or whether that was a mistake or a blunder that Russia committed. So first of all, if you observe this particular image, Russia, when it launched the Ukraine offensive, Now, various different intelligence leaks and everything, and looking at the hindsight is always the best teacher. So hindsight tells us that Russia made a strategic mistake. The special forces and all the armed forces of Russia, they had initially submitted a provision that within 3 weeks the entirety of Ukraine could be captured. They did not count in the resistance that would be offered. And it turned out that the number of troops that Russia sent, that turned out to be inadequate. So very quickly, not immediately, but after suffering from significant amount of setbacks, and a departure from the expectation and the expected norms, Russia recalibrated its stance, because Russia very soon realized, when I say very soon, understand that this war is going to continue for some time now again. So very soon in that parlance is around 8 to 9 months. So around after 8 to 9 months since the beginning of the onslaught, Russia realized that let us restructure, let us consolidate our position. By that point of time, Ukraine, backed by the Western forces and the arms and the ammunitions and the missiles that the Western forces had provided, had planned a counteroffensive. So what Russia did, Russia consolidated its position across the entire frontier, that we would not retreat from here. And they launched an offensive, particularly in the Donetsk Oblast. Now here, in the Luhansk and the Donetsk region, that is where the Russian military consolidated itself. Now, then you had a significant amount of fighting in the Bakhmut area. This is where, as Ukraine was planning its onslaught, the Russian troops kept them involved. Eventually, Bakhmut failed. Eventually, the Marinka region and Avdiivka region also fell. All these offensives, counteroffensives by Ukraine, they have started to fall. So now this article analyzes that after 2 years of the war, what is the impact on the Western powers and what is the impact on Russia? So when we talk about the impact on Western powers, the Western powers for a significant amount of time have been pumping lot of money into Ukraine. And their argument on the side of, let's suppose, the US Congress, the Democrats and the Republicans, they are not seeing eye to eye in their ultimate objective. Donald Trump, for example, who for most likely propositions will be elected as the future president, Donald Trump has publicly went ahead and stated that if and when he gets elected, he will stop giving funds for this cause. So where does that leave Ukraine into? Once US backtracks from giving funds to Ukraine, you can imagine the cascading impact it will have on all the NATO members. So that is where the limitation of the Western powers have come to the fore. But what about Russia? Is Russia in a very hunky-dory and perfect scenario? No. Russia has experienced setbacks which it did not even calculate or it could not even fathom. For example, from its vicinity. Now, why is it that Russia launched this offensive in the first place? Very basic, because it feared that NATO would come and the entire NATO alliance would come right up till its border, and that would pose danger to Russia. Ever since Russia has launched this offensive, two of its neighbors, they have joined the NATO alliance. Okay, Sweden, Finland, they have joined the NATO alliance. So that defies the entire purpose. Secondly, the sanctions imposed by the West have been so debilitating. It has caused a loss of revenue to Russia in the tune of more than $300 billion. That is huge. Now, countries like Armenia, again its border, a traditional Russian ally, Armenia has started boycotting the CSTO, the Security Forum, which has been pioneered and where Russia is the lead partner. So that is where its neighbors, its allies, its so-called friendly regions, they have started going against Russia. Secondly, Russia has now had to partner with rogue nations and rogue regimes such as North Korea, Iran, in order to get supply of military arms and ammunitions. Now, Russia is dependent on China. Russia is selling oil at a very cheap price to China, India, Brazil in order to gain some revenue. So Russia in itself has been put to the toughest of the dogs. So it is not benefiting Russia either. And it has exposed the limitations of the West. And the article argues, as and when the war goes on, further of these limitations, and what Minister Jaishankar also said on the sidelines of the Raisina dialogue, that you need to provide an exit option for Russia rather than limiting it and pushing it to a particular corner. Otherwise, if you push it to a corner, the world will basically become classified into block level politics, Cold War era politics again. Okay? Now, coming to the other article, the Global South stand on the Israel's war in Gaza. Now, Israel has launched an offensive, a counter-offensive rather, in the region of Gaza against the Hamas militants after the October 7 attacks, which overall claimed 1,000 Israeli lives. Now, that counter-offensive has been criticized by one and all, in the sense, not in the initial days, but nowadays, because of the lives that it is claiming, because of the innocent women and children who are dying by on a daily basis. Now here, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is taking a look at a case which has been brought on it, and it is another news story which broke last month, that South Africa tells the UN court that it's accusing Israel of apartheid against Palestinians. Apartheid as in racial discrimination, carrying out genocide. So that is where the UN General Assembly, under its advisory role or under the advisory power, it has asked the International Court of Justice to take a look at Israel's act in the region of Palestine, but not for this offensive, but for its previous actions. So the UNGA has asked for ICJ's advisory on Israel's occupation, settlement in the Palestinian region since 1967 war. What are the implications of it? And what are the legal implications of the larger world around? For that, the matter has been dragged to International Court of Justice. Now, as this matter has gone to the International Court of Justice and the hearing is happening, again, let me remind you that this matter which is there in front of the International Court of Justice is not because of the 7th October Hamas attack and the counteroffensive. It is about the previous settlement, occupation, and so-called annexation of the Palestinian territory after the 1967 war. So it is about the past events that Israel has been dragged to the court. But as these hearings are happening, nobody is talking about the past anymore. All the countries are talking about the present. What is happening in Gaza? What is happening in Palestine? Now, India had to make its stance clear. And India basically, even in the Munich Security Conference, Minister Jaishankar again made it amply clear that India stands significantly and steadfast manner behind the two-state solution, right? So where you have both of these countries coexisting. So India has maintained that stance, but it is not very vociferous and vehement in expressing support either towards Israel or towards the region of Palestine. It is maintaining its ambiguity, supporting all the measures for the Palestinian cause in terms of protection of lives, etc., but not openly criticizing Israel, because we have significant people-to-people contact, defense industry contact with Israel, and that is where the government has not been openly criticizing Israel as its policy for the past 10 years. But then you have the many countries of Middle East who have a different expectation from India. For example, Qatar. Qatar, which recently released the 8 naval officers of India. I'm sure the Qatar, and the article also argues that the Qatari Emirate and the entire establishment would have an expectation that India would toe that line in Palestine. Saudi Arabia would also have that expectation, right? So that is where India is at those kind of fork situation. But what about the global south? Now, Brazil is at loggerheads with Israel. The Brazilian president has compared the present actions of Israel in Palestine to that of Holocaust, which killed millions of Jews. As a result of that, Israel has declared the Brazilian president as persona non grata, that individual not to be allowed in Israel. Brazil has removed its diplomat from Israel as a countermeasure. South Africa has dragged Israel to the International Court of Justice. So when we talk about the global south, we are talking about the developing nations of the world. By hosting the G20 summit, India put a larger agenda to place itself as a leader of the global south. That is where India's stance is being looked at. And if India is not very clear, whatever its stance is, if it is not clear in its stance, then there is that possibility that the global south will look at someone else, like maybe China, to take that lead to find a solution. The faith that they have reposed and imposed in India, that might start weakening. Okay, that is the article and its discussion. Let's use it for the aspect of prelims also. So International Court of Justice, always relevant for the prelims portion. So it is one of the 6 principal organs of the UN. Its seat is at the Peace Palace in The Hague, the Netherlands. Now, this is one of the only principal organs of UN which is not stationed in, amongst the few principal organs not stationed in New York. So it has been established by the UN Charter of 1945. It replaced the Court of International Justice, the Permanent Court of International Justice. All 193 members of the UN can basically become parties and are automatically the parties to the court. Those who are not members of the UN can become the parties to the court under the Article 93 provisions of the ICJ. Chief function is to settle disputes submitted by the parties. Only if the parties submit it, then as per international law. Now, they can also give advisory opinions on legal matters when asked by the UNGA or any of the UN specialized bodies. It is under this provision that the UN General Assembly has asked for the opinion of the ICJ. Now, it has got a panel overall of 15 judges, and each of them have a 9-year tenure, right? So elections are held every 3 years for 1/3 of the seats, and the judges are distributed as per geography: 3 from Africa, 2 from Latin America and Caribbean, 3 from Asia, 5 from West Europe, and 2 from Eastern Europe. Okay, so that is basically the distribution of the judges, and hereby the judges from one particular country, you cannot have 2 judges which are elected. Okay, now let us take a look at few of the articles relevant from your prelims. Even this ICJ portion, by the way, is relevant only for your prelims portion. Now, here, after 11-year gap, Center discloses the key consumption expenditure survey data. So that is the data that we are talking about is all India household consumption expenditure survey. It is carried out by National Statistical Organization, NSO. So this survey has been released after 11 years. Last time it was carried out during the time of 2017-18, but that report was not released, was not allowed by the government, basically citing the lack of proper data sanitation. And what it said was the government said there were quality issues with the data. So the 2017-18 survey was not released. Now this survey which is released, this talks about the rise in expenditure levels, the per capita expenditure levels at both rural and urban areas. They have been increasing. But what is important for you to note for your prelims perspective is that the expenditure on the food items, look at the rural area, the expenditure on food items has been reducing continuously, and the expenditure on food item has reduced, and that on cereals has further reduced. In urban areas also, the percentage expenditure on food and cereals has reduced. Now, that means what? If let's suppose this is your overall income. Earlier you were spending this much amount on food. Now you are spending only this much amount. Let's suppose. Now you are spending only this much amount on food. So that means because of food inflation, your overall impact on spending, that has reduced. If the food inflation rises up, only 46% of your income is going for that. So that means this survey can eventually pave the way for reducing the proportion or the weightage of food products and food items in the CPI and the various inflation parameters. Now, it is the food parameters and the weightage of the food items which has got the highest amount of weightage in terms of the inflation index in at least the CPI rural. So that can mean that in the long run, if the weightage of food items is reduced, you can take a look at the softening of the inflation. Okay. Now, prehistoric case of Edwards syndrome found for the first time. Now here, looking at ancient skeletal remains, you have the scientists finding out evidences of Edwards syndrome. What is Edwards syndrome? Edwards syndrome, just like Down syndrome, is a deficiency or rather a malignancy of the chromosomes. So it is a genetic condition that causes physical growth delays even during the time of the fetal development. Okay, life expectancy of children diagnosed with this syndrome is very less due to life-threatening conditions. If the child survives the first year, then there are various intellectual and mental capacity challenges that they face through their lives. So that is the Edwards syndrome. It is the deficiency or rather the various different lacunae in the chromosomal setup. Okay. Now, then engineering exports may turn positive for 2023-24 despite weak demand. Now, because of global supply chain shocks and the ongoing conflicts, the engineering exports have suffered slightly, but December-January observed an uptick and we are very close to the last year's data numbers. That is what the article tells you. But let us use this to understand a bit about engineering exports. So what do we mean when we say engineering exports? So here, the capital goods, they constitute 58% of our engineering exports, consumer durables, non-ferrous metals and products, iron and steel, products made up of iron and steel, metallic minerals, etc. All of them, they form a part of it. So steel products, copper products, electric machinery, different kinds of machinery, etc. That forms the engineering product. If the engineering exports of a country is higher, that means its manufacturing sector is doing particularly good. And that is where India has successfully, in a way, achieved the diversification of its export market. Earlier, if you just take a look at the comparative analysis, in 1956-57, look at where our engineering goods would be exported. Largely in Asia and Africa. Now look at the diversification of the market. So you have West Asia, North America, North Africa region, the ASEAN region, the European Union region, Sub-Saharan Africa, Northeast Asia, South Asia, European portion, and North America forms a larger chunk. Which tells you what? That now our engineering exports are much more resilient to global supply shocks. Okay, so there has been a diversification of the export market. Now, then a sacrifice immortalized. This is the Samakka Saralamma Jatara, which is held. It is a biennial festival. It is considered to be the largest festival for the tribal community and the largest congregation of the tribal community anywhere in the world. And when it comes to the congregation of the people, it is considered to be second only after the Kumbh Mela in terms of the number of people who attend this Jatara. So this Jatara is celebrated by the Koya tribe, okay, right, in the region of Telangana. Now, that is where goods like jaggery, etc. is devoted to the goddesses. And these are the goddesses Samakka and Saralamma, they are the goddesses. Now, the folklore basically goes that these goddesses, they basically took up the opposition against the oppressive Kakatiya rulers of those particular times. And that is why in the veneration of that, now the goddesses, they protected the region against the onslaught of that oppressive king. And that is when the villagers, they started worshipping her, and after that it was celebrated as a festival. Okay, so that is the festival, also referred to as the Medaram Jatara. Because to be held in the Medaram region. So that is this particular festival and the biggest tribal fair. Keep that in mind. The Samakka Saralamma Jatara is the biggest tribal fair anywhere across the world. It becomes relevant for your prelims. Okay. Now let us take a look at the type of questions. Why is antimicrobial resistance a growing danger in developing world? Discuss the way forward in dealing with this scourge. So here in the introduction, talk about antimicrobial resistance. What is it? Then immediately after that, in the body portion of it, try to draw the flowchart about the spread of the antimicrobial resistance, the ways in which it can spread. That will add some of the descriptive value and presentation value to your answer. Then in the body part, start mentioning why it spreads in the developing part of the world: poor hygiene and sanitation conditions, less number of doctor to patient ratio, then poor state of diagnostic centers. All of this you can talk about, list it in points if you want, or in the bubble areas also. That will make it much more better presentable. So reasons you can cite. These are the reasons. Use the various bubbles. Poor hygiene, let's suppose. Okay. That is also something you can use. Then so on. So that you don't take much of this time and space and you are able to represent all the ideas there. Then after that, discuss the way forward. So the later part of the body will talk about the way forward, what can be done. The various, for example, the government of India launched the Red Line campaign and all the way forward that we discussed, including increasing awareness standards, reportage from the hospital-induced illnesses, all that you can mention. In the conclusion, write about that how this is a danger that the world is confronting, which can claim millions of lives at the turn of the century if proper action is not taken today. So the need of the hour is to have the wide-scale awareness and action on a mission mode. Okay? Now, analyze the contentions with the recent amendments brought to the Forest Conservation Act 1980. So talk about the Forest Conservation Act, why it was brought, what are the various issues of contention, why the amendment was brought over, talk about the entire Godavarman case, that aspect of certain areas being regarded as the deemed forest, what are the issues with that, all that you can talk about. Talk about the opposition to the aspect that why certain lands are made exempted, why certain areas are made exempted, what is the argument, what is the counter argument. Because it is a 15-marker question, you get the scope to do that. Eventually, in the conclusion aspect of it, you have to talk about the fact that the ultimate aim is to not only preserve the existing forest, but to increase the area under natural vegetation. For that, a close coordination is required at the central, state, and also the civil society organizations. People need to come to the table and then hammer a way out. And that will be your conclusion. So that marks the end of the analysis for today. I hope the analysis has been fruitful, beneficial. If you have liked the content, please click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.